Hello, I'm James Holland, and in this series exclusively for History Hit, I'm looking at armoured fighting vehicles of World War II. And today our attention turns to the ubiquitous Sherman Tank, what I believe was the best of the entire Second World War.
The Sherman Tank is probably the most recognisable armoured fighting vehicle of the entire war.
The development of the Sherman Tank is really interesting because everyone imagines that the US Army just arrived in the war in December 1941 following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, fully formed. Well, nothing could be further from the truth.
The origins of these tanks go back to the 1930s. Building on the effective suspension system and radial engines developed for light tanks, these carried forward into the next generation. The result was the M3 Grant, with a sponson-mounted 75mm main gun that had a limited traverse, and a smaller 37mm gun in the turret. But the M4 Sherman, as we now recognise it, was still in the works. Finally, in 1942, that evolutionary process resulted in this famous tank.
The Sherman Tank is what's known as a medium tank. It's 6 metres long, 3 metres wide, 3 metres tall. It weighs about 30 tonnes.
The M4 is built with a fully traversing turret that sits neatly on top of a standard chassis, housing a 75mm main gun.
So quite a high profile.
And the Sherman quickly made its mark.
The first tanks go into action at the Battle of Alamein in October 1942, and in fact among the very first tanks to be sent overseas are to British 8th Army, not to the US Army at all.
Its durable versatility was so great that by the end of the war these tanks saw action in North Africa, Western Europe, on the Eastern Front and in the Far East.
Reliable, mechanically sound, easy to maintain, and an all-round very, very effective weapon.
A weapon fit for a global war.
Well, to help me unpick the Sherman story, I'm joined today by Professor John Buckley of the University of Wolverhampton. And John, you know, looking at the Sherman, it's magnificent seeing it here, isn't it? But it is quite a story of how it gets developed and how it comes into being.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and it's a reaction to the way in which the United States sees the unfolding war in Europe, a recognition that they need a modern battle tank, something that's going to compete with what they're seeing happening in Europe, in the German army, in the French and the British. They learn from those, some of those mistakes and those issues, and they move through various stages in order to create a tank which is reliable, a good platform for a decent gun to deal with soft targets and hard targets, and so the Sherman is the reaction, or the M4 as it's known in the United States, is a reaction to that in order to see what how the war is developing.
So what are those lessons they're learning from kind of France in 1940?
They need a mobile platform. They need a gun which is capable of dealing with soft targets rather than tanks necessarily. And it's always perceived that tanks shoot at other tanks, but most of the time they're firing at soft targets. Right,
because what's firing at other tanks is mainly anti-tank guns.
Absolutely.
Which are not the same thing at all.
Yeah, totally. And that's the way in which the Americans consider how they're going to build tanks and how they're going to deal with enemy tanks. And the M4, the Sherman, is supposed to be a tank which is multi-purpose. It can support infantry on the battlefield, it can deal with soft targets, it's flexible, it's a mobile platform. But for dealing with enemy tanks, they have a tank destroyer idea and a concept, a platform which is basically just an anti-tank gun, a big anti-tank gun on a mobile platform, similar to the M4, but
so the same chassis effectively.
Yeah, but specifically for dealing with enemy tanks.
I mean, I always find it absolutely amazing to think that the US Army in 1939 is only around 189,000 strong, which might sound quite big by today's standards, but is absolutely tiny by 1939 standards.
Absolutely.
And it's been incredibly inward looking. It's kind of insular. It's kind of, we're not, after the First World War experience, we're not going to get involved with world affairs again. We're not going to play overseas. We're just going to stay in America. And there is that idea that if you have a small army, then you tend not to use it, and conversely, if you have a large army, you do tend to use it. And actually, history would show that that's pretty much true.
Indeed, yes.
But suddenly, the Atlantic is not the barrier that it used to be, and they've got to do something about it, and they've got to do something about it quick.
And it's the speed with which the Germans overrun much of Europe which catches everybody by surprise, and so the Americans have to react to that. They're thinking, we don't have to get involved. As you say, there's a big neutrality movement in the United States, but by 1940, it's clear this situation in Europe is getting out of hand. There may well have to become a situation where the Americans have to get involved. So they have to have modern equipment, an expanded army, expanded air forces, and they've got to think about how they would defend themselves and how they would intervene in a major war situation.
And the speed with which that development happens is really astounding, isn't it?
Yes, from an almost standing start, as you say, the Americans grow these huge armed forces, and massive plans are put in place to emphasise mass production techniques, how they're going to expand production really quickly, how they're going to get the kit and equipment ready, and all these plans are in place before the war breaks out for the Americans. So before December 1941, they're already thinking, this is what is likely to happen, how will we react to that situation? And they think big, and they think long term, they think in terms of systems and organisations and structures that will produce mass weapons of war such as the M4 in order to engage with an enemy the size of Germany in Europe.
Yeah, because that's the point about it, isn't it? Is that any kind of tank is an incredibly complex piece of equipment, and you want to make that complex piece of equipment as simple as you possibly can. You don't want to make it more complicated than it needs to be. I mean, I think it's worth us having a look around the outside of it now and looking at some of the features that it's got and seeing where that philosophy, that principles are coming through on the design.
Sure.
Well, John, talking about making something that's complex as simple as possible, look no further than the track and suspension system, because what have you got? You've got 7 wheels, 3 lots of 2 plus the end one, and then the sprocket, compared to, say, the Panther or the Panther with its 18 per side. Much less to deal with, and you can see the suspension bogies here are on the outside, not on the inside, which means you don't have to kind of take the whole track and wheel system to pieces to repair it. And actually you could even keep part of the tracks and wheels together if you wanted to and just take off one. And that sort of interchangeability is really, really handy, because it means you might have a knocked out tank with a sort of hole through the turret or something, but its tracks are absolutely fine. Whereas someone else is, another tank that's got a shell through here, and you just take one and put it on another. What could be easier?
Absolutely. Standardisation is critical in the field, and one of the big advantages the Allies have, and particularly the US Army, is that they standardise a lot of their arrangements on their armoured vehicles, so that there is that kind of interchangeability in a way that the German Army does not have. Each of their tanks often is very different, and so you can't swap those parts around. And ease of maintenance in the field is critical. You want your crew to be able to deal with many of these issues as much as you can, rather than getting specialist engineers in to deal with things. And if you can make it straightforward, it's simple, they can solve a lot of the problems in the field.
And John, I suppose another point is that when the Sherman first comes into the front line in the second half of 1942, for the most part the Allies are going forward, so they're sort of retaining the battlefield, aren't they? Which means, once the day's fighting's gone, armoured recovery vehicles can come onto the battlefield, beetle around, pull them out and get them repaired again.
Absolutely, and once you are advancing and you're able to win the battlefield, you're able to pull those tanks back into the line, get them fixed, get them back into action straight away. And those kind of advantages are enhanced by the fact that the vehicles themselves are easily maintained. You can get them back into action fairly quickly, and you've got plentiful supplies, you've got a plentiful line of communication supply back to the materials that you need in order to keep the vehicles back in action again. Now the Sherman is one of the more reliable vehicles. compared to certainly British tanks in the early stages of the war, where they broke down all the time, and there was a real problem by 1941-42, which is why the British Army loves the M4, the Sherman, when it comes in, because it keeps going, it moves, whereas a lot of British tanks don't. So they are reliable, but nonetheless, breakdowns and problems on the battlefield are often caused by mechanical issues and things as much as by enemy action. So having the ability to control the battlefield after an action and recover your vehicles, and then have a vehicle like this which is easily maintained, gives you a huge advantage.
I'm just sort of moving along, you can see this has got this kind of moulded hull here, and they had different types, because you could also have kind of flat-sided Sherman tanks, and again I suppose that suggests the basic soundness of its original design, where different manufacturers can manufacture these in different ways and yet still produce something which is absolutely one and the same.
Absolutely, yes, and the chassis, the basic chassis, is used on a whole range of vehicles, as well as the M4. It's used on the M10 tank destroyers, the M36 and so on, so have similar kind of layouts and so on. So you're just building different superstructures on the basic chassis because it's reliable, it works, and you've got that interchangeability option again.
And John, you can see they've got this extra armour plate here. This is obviously to protect the commander in the turret and the lap gunner co-driver here. But again, it sort of shows the kind of flexibility of the Sherman, that you can add these things on if you need to.
And these are a reaction to later war situations where there's concern about the armour protection on the Sherman being inadequate. So these are placed at various points in order to enhance the protection. There's a debate about whether they made that much difference actually, because the kind of ranges that actions were taking place in Northwest Europe in 44 and 45, enemy anti-tank fire would just go through the Sherman anyway. But it made a gesture towards the crew that an effort was being made, and particularly around the ammunition stowage bins and so on, which were on the inside of the tank, that he was trying to protect those. So it's a gesture towards making the tank more survivable. Whether it made any real difference or not is probably open to question.
Coming forward to the front of the tank, so lots of interesting features here. I mean, this hook, for example. I mean, you've got them at all four corners of the tank. This is what enables it to be winched off the quayside into a ship. You know, whether that be a landing craft or whether that be a Liberty ship that's going across the Atlantic. You know, a very, very important but simple feature of the tank. And I suppose actually what you can see, the advantage of the 75mm gun is it's not extending beyond the tank, which means that you know very clearly how many you can fit in a landing craft, whether it be landing in North Africa or Sicily or southern Italy, or indeed the D-Day beaches on Normandy. All these things are huge advantages, and yes, you can have a bigger tank, but that takes up more room on a ship. You know, so it's constantly kind of sort of weighing one thing against another, isn't it?
Yes, and the Allies have that problem. They've got to project their force against the enemy into continental Europe. You've got to manoeuvre and transport these vehicles to different theatres. So those kind of issues become critically important.
And we were talking earlier about sort of ease of maintenance. You know, here, just under here, you've got the transmission, the gearbox. And look at this, okay, some pretty hefty sort of wrenches are required, but you can just bolt this section off, get into the main compartment of the tank, pull out the gearbox, put another one in. It's not a big operation. It can be done in the field very, very easily.
Absolutely, and the ability of the crews to be able to deal with some of those issues easily themselves makes the tank more maintainable in practice.
And when you look at the turret and the gun mantlet, I mean, it does have a high profile. You can see on the top the cupola, which is rotational. It's got sort of armour plate hatch. The height of it is a problem, and certainly crews felt that they were very vulnerable. And of course, if you're a tank commander and you've got half your body and your head out of it, you feel very, very vulnerable. But of course, it gives you advantages as well.
Yes, and German crews captured in Normandy after the war argued that actually the Sherman's high profile was an advantage in the close terrain, because you could have a greater ability to see what was going on at certain times. You could see over particular obstacles and things, which are low profile tanks, okay in the defence, but not when you're trying to manoeuvre around too much. So it swings and roundabouts with the profile.
John, and here we are at the back, and you can see the engine here. This is a Canadian-built Sherman tank made by the Montreal Locomotive Company, and again, sort of indicative of the different manufacturers that are making them. And they had different Shermans had different engines. This one is a radial, a 9-cylinder radial engine, basically an aircraft engine. But one of the great features about the Sherman tank is it just used one type of oil for everything. I mean, what a genius thing that is. Absolutely, yes. And the ease and the maintenance, again, is a key issue here in being able to keep the tank mobile and operating in the battlefield. And there are lots of different types of Shermans with different kinds of engines and so on. Some of them are powered by diesel, some of them are petrol and so on. Which is always a cause of amusement. There's a petrol-fired tank. Is this a problem? In reality, in action, it's not really. But different kinds of engine types and so on for different kind of environments mean that the tank is flexible, can be used in lots of different situations. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you just open the hatch up at the back. It's got another one at the top here if you need to pull the whole engine out. But you know, an engine can be taken out of a Sherman tank and replaced, you know, in an hour and a half, couple of hours, something like that in the field if you really, really need to. And again, that just gives you so much flexibility. Absolutely. Well, John, like all other tanks of the Second World War, it's pretty cramped in here. I can tell you it's not as cramped as the T-34, but it's not saying a huge amount. Obviously painted white so that it's easier to see. Bring all the hatches down. And the experience of having 3 people squashed into this area and so on shows you how compact and so on the operating conditions were for the crew inside the tank itself. But you know, this is not uncomfortable, I would say. I mean, lots of good features about this. A gun stabilising gyro, not that effective, but no other tank has it. Absolutely, it's an advantage, and it's the first time a modern tank has tried that kind of equipment, and it's an advantage when the tank's grinding to a halt and stopping, that the gun is stabilised at the moment at which you might actually start firing with some kind of degree of effectiveness. And very, very quick firing, this gun, that's the other thing. A mixture of armour piercing, which is useful, and also high explosive, which has a different fuse tip which you can change so it will explode, you know, half a second or a second after it hits. And a good guard around here. So you're unlikely to be injured from the recoil in this tank, really. You know, these are small features, but important features, really. Ammunition stowage is a key issue in a tank. You want access to your ammunition. The Sherman has a supply which is carried in the turret itself. But there are ammunition bins at the front as well, which have to be accessible. That's what those armour plates were there to try and protect, to make them less vulnerable. Later on, Sherman's moved to having a wet stowage system where the ammunition is kept low level in water jackets and so on to stop flare, a problem which is one of the difficulties of combustibility in tanks during the war. I mean, they got a bit of a bad reputation, didn't they, for being Ronsons and Tommy cookers and all this kind of stuff, this idea that they were very flammable and would easily kind of burn. But evidence suggests that they weren't more flammable than any other tank. No, and it's the tank got a reputation for a time in northwest Europe, and it appeared to have been a problem. And a lot of the criticism came that it was a petrol-fired tank and that the fuel was the problem. But reports and investigations demonstrated ammunition storage, and crews would store ammunition openly in the turret. And when the tank was penetrated, the cordite in the ammunition would explode about 5 or 6 seconds after the tank was hit. So you had this strange situation: the tank would be hit, and then, like in Hollywood movies, it doesn't explode straight away. It explodes about 5 or 6 seconds later. But that was down to the ammunition, not down to the fuel. Once crews started to use different kind of ways of storing the ammunition, wet stowage came in, that problem started to go away. Of course, one of the problems is that if a tank like this gets hit, quite often the shell that's hitting it might not, or projectile that's hitting it might not actually penetrate. But what it does do is it punches out a glob of metal from the inside, one big lot, and lots of smaller lots, spalling. And of course, this is white hot. And if a white hot bit of spalling penetrates the casing around the ammunition, around the propellant of a shell, that's when your problems start to arrive. Interesting that one of the features later in the war that the German tank complained about was that the armour plate on their tanks wasn't as effective or as high quality as it had been earlier in the war, and they splintered and shattered far more than previously. Allied tanks don't particularly have that problem. Yeah, I mean, when you're sat inside the belly of a tank like this, you cannot help but think about the experience of the crew, though, can you? And what it must have been like in here. And you know, there's 5 of them in a very small space. It's all Christian names, really, because there's no room for a kind of formality in a tank. You all have to completely trust one another and trust them in the job that they're doing. The smell in here, you know, after a day would get pretty ripe. Body odour, urine, cordite, smoke, fumes, oil, rubber. Quite a cocktail, really, and you know, no nod to the health and safety executive, really.
No, none at all. You just have to get on with it, and you can see why crews would complain about or suffer from the difficulties of this kind of environment and fighting on for a sustained period of time. Often 12, 15 hours a day, you could be stuck in something like this. No access to the outside, or very little access to the outside. It takes a special kind of resolve to be able to cope with that for sustained periods of time.
Yeah, and when you think about a tank commander, particularly a company commander or squadron commander in the case of the British, you know, you just think about the awesome amounts of responsibility that they've got. You know, they've got to have their head and shoulders out, because otherwise you're using periscopes. And the periscopes are kind of next to useless. You've just got this very, very narrow vision, and it's very sort of discombobulating, really. You need to see that 360 degrees. So you're vulnerable. You've got to concentrate the whole time. You've just got to be watching. Every decision you make might be a matter of life and death. So, but you can't faff around. You just got to make it just like that. You're on your feet the whole time. You've got to concentrate all the time. So the physical and mental strain of doing it must have been absolutely immense. And of course, it's an incredibly dangerous business. That's not got anything much to do with the tank itself. That's just the nature of tank warfare.
The tank commander was the most vulnerable member of the crew, because he's commanding with head stuck out at the top, and they recorded that they had to do that in order to see what was going on, because you say you can't see a great deal, but also that some interviews I've done, tank commanders would operate with the radio headsets and things, but have one ear open so they could hear what was going on around them, so they could hear the battlefield, and they wanted to sense what was going on for that situation awareness idea, because it's the only way you could monitor and maintain some kind of control. If you're a troop commander and you're commanding not only this tank, but 2 or possibly 3 other tanks as well, you can see the level of responsibility and the difficulties of commanding in battle in those kind of situations.
Yeah, absolutely, and you need headphones, because just to communicate with your crew, there's a tank crew intercom, and then there is the wider net to keep you in contact with the rest of the squadron stroke company, and then another net which is to keep you in touch with the rest of the regiment, so, or battalion, whichever way you're looking at it. But there's a lot to listen to, a lot to watch, a lot to concentrate on, and as you say, you know, in high summer, very, very long days, perhaps starting at 3:30 in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and not finishing till past midnight.
Absolutely, and I mean, a further level of complication was communicating with infantry formations. One of the key problems you have is how a tank commander or troop commander cooperates with infantry formations around them. It's an extra layer. You've got to talk to people in kind of a different language, with different situations. How do you communicate with them within this kind of environment? It's another layer of difficulty. And
that involves commanders getting out of the turret quite a lot, doesn't it? Clambering down, going and talking to the infantry. And of course, the moment you get out, you're then vulnerable again, then you've got to get back in again. And of course, in a high profile tank like this, yes, that gives you extra visibility, but that also makes you more vulnerable. I suppose one of the things that I think is so good about this particular gun, though, is the quick firing nature of it, and you can just kind of you know fire shell after shell, and what it seems is that he who fires first tends to win, because of course, say you're an enemy tank, or say you're in a tank and you're hit first, your first reaction is to close those hatches and come inside. The moment you do that, you can't see very much. There's lots of smoke, so you're thinking, where did that come from? And while you're kind of concentrating and trying to work out through the fog of war what's going on, the tank that's attacked you in the first place has fired off another 6 rounds. And in something like the Sherman, you really can do that. So you have an incident such as on the 26th of June 1944 when Major John Semkin of A Squadron of the Sherwood Rangers manages to fire off 10 rounds at a Tiger tank before the Tiger even fires one. And they're facing off one another. It is amazing though, isn't it, sitting here, because it does make you realise just how awkward and difficult and claustrophobic it must have been being a part of a tank crew.
Yes, and it's not an environment you would necessarily want to fight in. In saying that, however, it is a safer place on the battlefield than being an infantryman. If you're a rifleman, your life expectancy is much lower than if you're in a tank crew. However, once a tank gets hit and it starts to go up and you're trapped inside here, that's when it becomes much more of a pressure, and you can see why tank crews suffer particular kinds of kind of battle exhaustion, battle fatigue.
John, another difference between this and the T-34, of course, is that the turret has this basket, this sort of mesh cage. And so the turret crew move around with the turret. So their position is always static, whereas in the T-34, you're sort of skedaddling around trying to sort of keep up.
Yes, and it's an advantage, and the turret on this vehicle is battery powered so that it moves independent of whether the engine is on or not. Yep. So again, that's an advantage in particular situations. So it's a more flexible working environment, and that enhances the ability of the crew to remain on high level readiness and effectiveness for long periods of time.
Yeah, and the speed at which the turret rotates is quicker than most tanks as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and in situations where you're tracking enemy target at some distance or reacting to something, that's a huge advantage.
Yeah, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that it's not all about armour and a big gun. And it is very interesting, isn't it, that when the Germans and the British, both in the early part of 1942, are kind of thinking, okay, we need to upgrade our tanks, what do we need? For the Germans, the priority is big gun, big armour, thick armour. Whereas for the British, the priority is ease of maintenance and reliability.
Yes, I mean, the Germans are confronting new difficulties on the Eastern Front, and that there's more open terrain, longer ranges, so those kind of issues about big guns and big armour become more important. For the British, they've had 2 years of operating with tanks which break down all the time. The top of their list of priorities is a tank that actually moves when it's supposed to move, critically important.
John, I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about yet is just the sheer numbers of the Sherman tank. I mean, it's not quite up there with the T-34, but 49,000 of these and 74,000 Sherman hulls, you know, showing how versatile it was, that it could be used as mobile artillery, as armoured personnel carriers and tank destroyers and so many different things.
It's a perfect weapon for a mass industrial war. It needs to be produced in huge numbers. It's got to fight in a whole variety of different environments and different situations and scenarios. It's got to have flexibility, it's got to be reliable, and it's got to fulfil a need, and that's the need that the Allies have at that particular point in the war in order to take the war to the Axis powers.
Yeah, and let's not forget that it's not just North Africa and Northwest Europe where these are seeing action, but it really is all around the world, you know, Southeast Asia and throughout the Pacific too, and that counts for a lot.
It does, and in terms of a flexible weapon for a major series of campaigns against Axis powers, you need a weapon like the M4 Sherman.
Well, John, it's been great having you here today, so thanks for joining us. I mean, I've got to say, for me, the Sherman is just tops. Okay, so, you know, it doesn't have as big a gun as the Panther or the Tiger, and it doesn't have as much armour. But you can't look at tanks in the Second World War just on those criteria. There's so many other things to think about as well. And in the round, it just starts building up all those points. You know, its versatility, its reliability, its ease of maintenance, the fact that you can put it in all different types of shipping, the fact that it can see action all around the world, you know, that really, really counts. So for me, the Sherman tank is absolutely the tops.
Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel. Hope you enjoyed that video. And if you'd like to see more videos where we attempt to try and bring history to life, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Cheers guys, see you soon.